Alrighty, thanks everyone for joining. We're going to go ahead and get going. I know that this is everyone's favorite topic, compliance, and specifically PCI. So thank you for everyone for joining. Again, I know that we all don't like talking about compliance, but unfortunately, is it a necessary thing? And so my goal today is to help us with various nuances and subtleties to the PCI standard. So in way of introduction, though, I am Jonathan Smith. I'm a QSA with a local PCI consulting firm, QSA Qualified Security Assessor. I go in and I help organizations identify gaps in PCI compliance, and I also help issue opinions when we see those gaps remediated and when we evaluate organizations as they become PCI compliant to issue the formal opinion that yes, this organization is PCI compliant. And so because of this background, I've been doing this for quite some time. Me and my colleagues have identified a number of areas and where we see some common myths and misconceptions. PCI at face value looks to be a very black and white standard. But I'm sure a lot of you have encountered that there's, again, a lot of nuance, some gray area, some misunderstandings, and so that's what I want to hit on today. Now, my goal is not to strike fear or to even come across as condescending or anything like that, because again, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but we're all on the same team here. We're trying to protect the payment ecosystem, and again, we see a lot of areas in which there can perhaps be some cleanup and some protection on our systems, and that's what I want to address today. And so I'm going to jump right into it. I have a lot of topics in here, so I'm going to go kind of rapid fire through these topics, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, mainly because, again, we don't like to talk about compliance, so I'm going to try to keep it short, but I still want to hit a lot of meaty topics. So talking about this first topic of configuration drift. So we'll see that a lot of organizations when we go in year over year. We'll assess an organization and they're PCI compliant. But then we'll come in a year later and we take a sampling of new systems and we look at particular settings and say the organization props up 10 new web servers. We'll look at these new web servers, but unfortunately these web servers weren't configured to get NTP from the central NTP server. And so configuration drift, this concept that we make things compliant, but then over time we forget about them, or we forget we're supposed to do something, and things fall out of compliance over time. And so this configuration drift can be addressed with various things: centralized management, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Salt, Active Directory, etc. And so we highly encourage centralized management to help to try to address the centralized drift, because again, we're all humans and we're subject to forgetting things. And so tools are very important to help combat configuration drift. The next topic is VOIP. We'll go into call centers or organizations that may not even be call centers, and we start learning you're taking cardholder data over telephone calls. Oh, you're using VOIP? Well, VOIP, all your VOIP systems are in scope, and we're generally met with a surprise, shock. Why is this in scope? The PCI Council, and for those of you who aren't aware, the PCI Council is the organization that sets the PCI standards. They have instructed us, both QSAs, organizations, etc., that VOIP is to be treated just like any other type of IP network in terms of scope and applicability of PCI requirements. So unfortunately, we'll see that VOIP is missed a lot in terms of bringing the VOIP systems into compliance. So remember that. VOIP is certainly in scope if you're taking cardholder data over phone calls. The next is applications. We'll see that organizations are fairly competent and good at securing their systems in the sense of the distributed systems, Linux, Windows, routers, switches, etc. But when it comes to applications, whether it's a web-based application, a custom-based web application, or an application installed on a workstation, that we see misses in terms of logical access logging, such as, well, how is access to this application? If you have this application publicly exposed on a web interface and your customers are logging in, or even internally exposed and your call center employees are logging to this application, how are you controlling access to this application? How are passwords, what are your password parameters? How are you protecting the underlying password files? And building upon that in terms of logging in this custom application, when folks are accessing cardholder data via the application, are you logging who was accessing cardholder data via that application? Who was making configuration changes to these applications? And then building upon that, if you're not logging, how can you monitor? How do you know what's going on with this application? So again, make sure that that applications are being watched. Next, and I know we love this topic, and this topic gets hounded at security conferences all the time, patching, patching, patching. But I want to make a subtle distinction here, maybe not so subtle. We'll see that organizations are great using WSUS, for example, and we're hitting Patch Tuesday, and we're making sure this operating system is patched, and maybe these Microsoft products. But what about Java? What about Adobe Reader? What are we doing for third-party products that maybe aren't being addressed with WSUS? It's admittedly a little bit more difficult in terms of trying to bring these third-party products and keeping them up to date. We may have internal dependencies on custom-coded software, or again, we just don't have the tools to try to patch all the third-party products in a consistent manner. But obviously, the bad guys are counting on that. So again, look into tool. I'm not going to hawk any type of third-party products. There's plenty of other vendors and plenty of resources online. But again, we're doing good on patching underlying operating systems using WSUS, YUM updates, etc. But these third-party products often fly under the radar. Next is change management governance. Again, this is an area where organizations do fairly good with code pushes and code changes, that we make sure that we're documenting them. We're making sure that we're testing our changes, and that we can roll them back if we need to, and that we're getting proper approvals, whether we're going through a waterfall methodology or more DevOps, Agile, etc. But the nuance here is that change management for PCI is required not just for code changes, but for all changes. So it's pretty pervasive. I mean, we talk about schema changes to the database. That needs to go through a change management process. When we are deploying new systems, that's changing the environment. Are we doing that in a controlled manner? Another big one is going back to patching firmware updates. When we're making changes to the systems that are within scope of PCI, are we again doing them in a controlled manner? Now, I know that there are certain aspects that organizations have a hard time with accepting, things like, well, Patch Tuesday, when we're just rolling out patches, do we really need to have approvals and testing and rollback plans? There are discussions we've had with our clients to help to try to address those concerns and also be compliant with the requirements in terms of some sort of organizational documentation and policies for Patch Tuesdays, etc. But at the end of the day, you have to address these requirements. You can't say that we don't agree with it, so we don't adhere to it. There are ways in which you can be compliant with requirements and still meet your operational objectives. Moving on, service providers. So organizations that store, process, transmit cardholder data, that interact, that have or consume services from other entities that could impact the security of that cardholder data environment are in scope for PCI compliance. And so as part of that, there's several things that you have to do with these organizations. One, first off, is you need to know what these organizations are. You need to have a listing of these organizations. And I'm just going to throw this out there. One of the big misses that we see are MPLS providers. So if you have one office at one site and an office at another site, a call center over here, your data center over there, and you're all connecting them with MPLS, and you're transmitting cardholder data over these private connections, your MPLS provider is most certainly a service provider, and you need to manage them in a way in which you can get comfort that this MPLS service provider is not going to be a cause of a breach for you. And so what do you need to do? You need to do your due diligence with these service providers. Enter into some sort of written agreement with them that they will protect cardholder data to the degree that they could affect the security of it. It's our responsibilities to check and see if they have an attestation of compliance. An attestation of compliance is a document that is that attests to the PCI compliant status of that service provider. But perhaps the biggest thing with service providers, and where we see a lot of difficulty, is when you're engaging with a service provider, we're supposed to have a list of requirement or a list of responsibility of me as an organization. What is my responsibility for PCI? And then as a service provider, what's the service provider's responsibility? what we typically see is a big matrix of all the PCI requirements and then columns of this is my responsibility and then this is the responsibility of the service provider. The goal of that is, again, if there were to be a breach someday, you both can't look at each other, well, I thought you were doing that, I thought you were doing that. It's really critical that when you engage with a service provider that you have very well defined boundaries of who's doing what. Moving on, phantom payment channels. So we often think of PCI as an IT problem or an IT issue. And it certainly is an IT problem or an IT issue, but the business is really critical, and it's a business problem too. It's the business that defines what the payment channels are. It's the business that's causing us needing to be PCI compliant in the first place. The business is what's saying we need to take credit card numbers. And so IT help us understand what we need to do to be compliant, or these are what our payment channels are, so you make sure that they're compliant, and then it's IT's job to make sure those payment channels are compliant. So it's really critical to involve the business in determining what the flow of cardholder data is, because the business is what determines what the flow of cardholder data is. A prime example is we'll go into organizations and IT will tell us about their e-commerce websites and their point-of-sale devices, but then we sit down and we talk with business personnel, and they tell us how, oh yeah, we're getting emails with credit card information, and then we'll go type those into our e-commerce website. And IT just kind of stares blankly at the people that are taking credit card data over email because that was unknown. So then we can have discussions over, well, this is how the proper way to take credit card information. So again, it's really important to involve the business. Moving on, user roles. So there are certain requirements that user roles are to be documented. So administrators, developers, a customer service agent. I mean, these are fairly high-level documentation requirements, such as a CSR, a customer service user, level 1, they get access to a workstation, and then to our application X, and they can view cardholder data. And then CSR2, they can have access to a workstation, and they can have access to application X, but they cannot see cardholder data. And so very high-level, simple definitions of what the roles are. We'll get a typical responses when we start looking at what are your user roles that are documented is, well, we have a user provisioning process where a manager will approve access, and in these user provisioning forms we say they need access to workstation X and they need access to application X to view cardholder data. And the typical response is, that's great and that's actually necessary as well, but that user provisioning process inherits from these defined roles and responsibilities that when managers and personnel are approving, are we doing it within the confines in which the organization has accepted? Those are two distinct PCI requirements, and they stand independently from each other. So again, documentation of user roles. Moving on, shared administrative accounts. This is one of my favorite ones. We'll go into organizations and they're using LDAP, they're using Active Directory for central authentication, but then we'll see an admin account or a local admin account on your switches, on firewalls, on workstations, etc. And we ask, well, who knows the password to those accounts? And it's typically, well, 3 or 4 different people. Unfortunately, PCI does not allow for multiple individuals to know the password to one single account. And so, I mean, we get some of the reasons of why you would, or why we don't want to have these local accounts that we'll see, if are they there for emergency purposes? What if LDAP goes down? What if Active Directory goes down? We need to be able to access our systems. We don't want to be locked out. We don't want to let the dinosaurs get out. And so we understand that, but we have to stand back and look at the risks involved with that too. Obviously, we're not dealing with dinosaurs in our line of work, but we are dealing with things that would cause our lives great stress if we were to lose access to systems. But this requirement is really rooted in accountability. If you are one of those 4 administrators that know that local admin password, I would be kind of scared in terms of the liability if one of those 3 other admins were to do something funny and be the cause of a breach, because at the end then it comes down to any type of forensics, and it comes down to, well, this account was used, who knows the password, and it's 4 people. Well, all 4 people, are you going to be implicated in whatever happened? Because that accountability is gone. And so when we see that with organizations, we'll sit down and we'll talk through, is this really needed? What can we do to help address both your concerns of trying to keep things up and going and operational, not being locked out, but also get to that individual accountability. And so again, there's some different things that we can see in terms of assigning accountability. So I'm going to throw one example out there that, and again, this is a risk-based approach as well in terms of the operational side of the house. But say you reset that local admin password to just where one admin knew the password, but you're using LDAP and Active Directory, and everyone else has, including the person who knows the emergency account, they have their own individual Active Directory LDAP passwords. Say that individual that knew the shared admin account, got hit by a bus, won the lottery, whatever you want to choose. Well, then what you would do is one of those other admins that is still the organization, it would be the designated emergency account holder, and they would reset the password of that emergency account, and they would set it to something that they knew using their LDAP or Active Directory credentials. And so that way you can, again, maintain knowledge of that emergency account if it were needed to be used, but you can, again, still have audit logs and accountability of who is using that account. So moving on, scope. So we'll see that PCI requirements are typically applied to systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. That's generally very clear. But where the big miss that we see is all the connected systems. PCI requirements apply to systems that are connected to systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. It's very pervasive, and it's not fun to deal with those connected to systems. But we got to look at pivot points, and I mean, this being a security conference, there's a lot of ways in which systems can be compromised and pivoted, and so we can't discount the nature of connected systems. Moving on to misconceptions. The QSA is the bad guy. The reality is we want to get done with assessments. We want to get done with audits too. The QSA is trying to help. The QSA is not the one trying to compromise the cardholder data. We're not looking to see about getting people fired and people in trouble. Again, we want to help. Our reputations are on the line as well. When we're going into organizations and we're signing reports saying that an entity is PCI compliant, we're putting some risk out there for ourselves as well. And so, again, to emphasize though that we want to get these assessments done. We find great joy in going into entities and finding out that there's not a lot of remediation. They're doing things great. Contrary to popular belief, it's actually discouraging for us when we find issues and we have to have hard discussions, and it's not fun. But at the end of the day, because our reputation is on the line, we will call out issues when we see them. And we will work with our clients in identifying those issues. And so that's just, I mean, again, the QSA is not the bad guy. We're there to help, again, secure the payment ecosystem. The next is misconception is layers, is that, well, I've applied a requirement here, so I don't need to do it over there. Or the PCI, there's a bunch of PCI requirements, and so I'm doing this one, so I don't need to do that PCI requirement. So some examples of, say I VPN in and I use a password with my rotating token, and I VPN into an organization or into my network, and it's like, well, I guess I don't need to have password authentication as I SSH or RDP from one system to another, and I don't need to use certificates or whatever it may be. The reality is you need to have those requirements applied at every layer. If you again, password, use your rotating MFA token and username to get to VPN into your environment, you still need to have authentication credentials as you RDP and SSH around to different systems. Another good example is, say, a WAF that an organization may say that, hey, I have a web application firewall, so therefore I don't need an intrusion detection system because intrusion detection systems are dumb. Well, there's a requirement for both, and they have different functionalities. They operate at different layers. They provide a different layer of security, and so it's important that we look at security in layers again, and we just don't discount requirements because of they're being done somewhere else or it's being negated by another PCI requirement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, and I've heard this one. QSA, our network is so complex you don't even need to look at it. No. So. MFA, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one. So this is kind of a hot topic for PCI these days. So in the past, and it still is a requirement, that when I come from, and I'm going to use a fairly simplistic example here, and this is not representative of everyone's networks, and you all have different implementations. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me or my colleagues afterwards or another QSA, and we can help address any questions, implementation-specific questions. But in this particular example, we have our laptop, we're coming from home, we're coming from Starbucks, and we want to VPN in through the corporate firewall to get onto the corporate network, which is represented by that top right quadrant of this little simple diagram. And then from there, we either get on a jump host or our workstation desktop that's sitting at work, and then from there we RDP, SSH, HTTPS, whatever management interface we want to use to get into the cardholder data environment. Again, historically and still current, we would have multi-factor authentication. We'd have a rotating token or some sort of second factor on that VPN connection as we got into the firewall. And again, that is still the case. But in our simplistic example, the new requirements are that if I'm coming from my corporate network or from this trusted location to get into the cardholder data environment for administrative purposes, I need to have multi-factor on that layer as well. As I get into the cardholder data environment. So the implications are that I have MFA when I'm VPNing into my corporate network, I get onto my desktop at work, but then when I get from my desktop and then I do RDP or SSH, I have to have MFA as I'm entering into the cardholder data environment at that layer. And again, I know this is a very simplistic example, but just wanted to illustrate that the former multi-factor requirements are still in place, but that the new multi-factor requirements are bringing in one further step. So. Moving on, vulnerability scan timing. In the past, it's been that I've done my quarterly vulnerability scan. I've done it in January of 2018, but that's so I got my Q1, and then for Q2, I do it in May of 2018. So therefore, I have quarterly scans, one in both quarter. Well, the PCI Council, again, who defines the standard, have clarified to us that the maximum amount of time between scans is 90 days. So if you're doing a scan on January 1 and you got your clean internal vulnerability scan, the latest in which you can have your next quarterly scan would be March 1st. You can't wait till May. So moving on, so relativity here in terms of significant changes. You all may be familiar with the many requirements in the standard that talk about significant changes. When you have significant changes in your organization, you're supposed to do vulnerability scans, you're supposed to be doing penetration tests, etc. It's fairly often we'll go into an organization and we'll ask for, well, what were your significant changes, so that we can see that the vulnerability scans were done, the penetration tests were done, and the response will be to us, well, you tell us what a significant change is. And frankly, as a QSA, and as an external entity, we can't do that because significant changes are relative to an organization's. From our little plain example, the guy juggling the ball, from his perspective, that ball's going up and down. But from the guy on the ground's perspective, as he sees that guy juggling the ball, that ball is actually going in an arch. And so, again, significant changes are relative to every organization. If you're a cloud provider that you're spinning up web servers every single day, adding a new web server, removing a web server from your environment is not a significant change. Again, if that's something that is happening, again, on an hourly basis or depending on the size of your cloud provider. But what if you're an organization that has five servers and you add one new server every year? In that case, adding that web server may be a significant change for you because it's something that you're not doing on a daily basis, and there's potential risk for doing something that you're not maybe used to doing. I do want to caveat though, as a QSA though, we will do a sniff check. If organizations say that, oh, we don't have any significant changes and we see something that sure seems to be significant, we'll discuss that with you. Again, because we're putting our name down to this, but at the end of the day, it's not the QSA that defines what significant is. We'll help you with that, but it's up to the organizations we're assessing. So vulnerability scan results. We'll often see that our vulnerability scanner will spit out what the vulnerabilities were, what the ratings are, and hey, that's good. We'll take that as doctrine and move on with that. It's obviously not a bad thing to take the output from these vulnerability scanners and use them in your internal processes. But the reality is, there is latitude in the standard for you to interpret the output from those vulnerability scan results. The vulnerability scan results may say you have a high vulnerability, but as you look at things, you can say, well, we actually don't have that. We're not using that module in our firewall or whatever it may be, and this is a false positive, and so can you downgrade that high vulnerability? But the flip side is, what if you find this vulnerability scanner saying you have a medium or a low? You look at that in context of your environment. Is that something that actually may be high for you? And you may need to remediate sooner than later. So again, apply vulnerability scan results are obviously great, but they do need to be evaluated. So next is my favorite is samples. So we'll see, as an organization with 100 servers, we'll take a look at 20 of them. The idea being that those 20 servers are representative of the greater population. And so, but say for those 20 servers, we find issue with 10 of those servers that perhaps they're going back to NTP, they're not getting NTP from the central domain controller or whatever it may be. So we say remediate it. Then we'll get evidence that those 10 deficient servers were fixed. But then it begs the question, what about the rest of the population? If there were 8 samples that had issues, statistically speaking, that means that you have issues elsewhere. And so it's the QSA's responsibility at that point to ascertain what was done to fix the rest of the population. That could include resampling, looking at change tickets, etc. So the point being, sampling is acceptable for validating compliance. Sampling is not acceptable for applying the requirements. And kind of wrapping up here, this misconception that PCI is annual, and this kind of goes back to what I started out with, that at the beginning, that we get a report, and the report on compliance, the auditor has said that, hey, you're PCI compliant, and that's great. We should celebrate. We should be really happy. And I don't mean to be a downer with this, but you got logs to review tomorrow. PCI is something that we need to stay on every day. So it's great to get the report, but again, the PCI requirements are requirements to be applied on a daily basis. And then just to wrap up, some of the things, the high level, I guess, summary is that the QSA can't make you guys compliant. We can help, and we love to help, and we provide, try to provide some thoughts and consultation, and how can we apply these PCI requirements, because there certainly is a lot of nuance and gray area. So if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me, talk to other QSAs. There's online resources, the PCI Council's website. But again, I appreciate the time. I hope this is helpful. Again, I'm trying to hit things that you can take and maybe go back to your organizations and look at and say, do we need a little bit of remediation here or fixing here? If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Thanks.